catalyst or the impetus I was thinking of feeling about it was being in my garden here, and by um, by doing, I suppose, astute or conscious design, like we were discussing at the front end of the process, I felt like um, the it's like the infrastructure or the conceptual um, baseline, the maybe even the large scale ecosystem dynamics, if we were discussing something like that, are taken because you've considered those. You don't need them to be, I suppose, front loaded in your mind. You don't have to be considering those, and so they can get effectively parked for the time
Mm,
being. And so
mm,
you're able to be. I find I'm able more able to enjoy the experience of just taking a ripe tomato off and eating it on the spot, and not
mm,
thinking about, do they need fertilizing? Are they in the best spot? At least for a moment, you know, you
mm,
might take a couple more steps and you're back into both modes of enjoying
mm,
being completely present and immersed, but
mm,
you're also more, not maybe cerebrally, but maybe it's all happening in your mind, that processing of, oh, what's this? Is this black spot looking like fungus, or is there enough irrigation in this corner, or what's happening over here, or
mm,
those
mm,
kinds of,
mm,
and I guess ultimately we're always switching between those two, or doing both at the same time, and maybe we're more aware of one or the other at
mm,
particular
mm,
times.
mm,
And yeah, and so I was just playing around with that idea, I suppose, of, and bearing in mind your the over veggie patch megastructure that you were discussing, of all the pipe work and possibly over engineering, and but
mm,
once that's done, and then you're able to just enjoy what happens. It's a little bit like choosing plant species for your vertical garden designs.
mm,
If the considerations for the conditions are appropriate,
mm,
more it's more nuanced than right and wrong, I suppose.
mm,
But if they're appropriate, then once it's planted, then you are able to experience, or just tune into a bit more of what the ecosystem is doing,
mm.
rather than what it rather than what it needs in those large scale fundamentals, I suppose, I think is where I was going with it. But
Okay, fantastic.
yeah, not
Yeah,
really sure.
no, sure. It does make sense. I guess that some people love planning, some people love playing. Some
Yeah,
people like to switch off. Some people don't want it too intense, but some people really thrive in it. And I guess this ties in perfectly with the work I do, as well as the playing I do at home, and my assessments. And
yep,
a great example. Well, let's just jump straight into it, into the veggie patch, for example.
yeah,
We're in the subtropics,
yep,
and many people might not know that the subtropical summers are actually one of the most challenging times of the year to grow veggies. People
right,
think the warmth is great and everything's just going to be boosted, but actually, what happens is everything does get boosted. All your lettuces bolt. As soon as you plant them, they can flower in a few weeks and you can't harvest off them. Um, Many species get hit by humidity and quite a lot of rain if you've got this is a rainy season, and
yep,
just the constant heat. But not only that, nature's supercharged. All the butterflies come out, all the caterpillars, all the bugs. We've got fruit fly, you've got everything happening, and quite a few people sometimes throw their hands up and they just switch off. They go on holiday for the 3 months and then they come back and wait for the 9 months of cooler weather. And
right,
that's a challenge for a lot of people. But a lot of people net and they cover up their produce to protect them as well. You've got hail and thunderstorms, etc. But you can also use it to
yep,
your advantage. Now, a lot of people, I think, primarily often grow plants that are just challenging in that climate. So, for example,
yeah,
cool climate European food, trying
yep,
to grow it in the subtropics, you can get away with it, but you won't necessarily be able to do 12 months of it. So you've got to structure it and think that through. You have to have a game plan before you start. And my
yep,
thought was, um, I'm going to try and achieve so many different things with my veggie patch. I'm going to have seasonal change. I'm going to have 9 months of beautiful, coolish weather where I can grow all the western stuff, but at the same time, I want to celebrate the subtropics and the tropics. And
yep,
I've got to do all of that in the same place. So I've got a few raised veggie beds some that are going to be wicking, some that are just straight raised beds, full to soil connected with the ground. And then I'm going to have in-ground growing as well. And what I realized when I moved into this area was that we have quite significant winds, and they rack through the place. And I thought, how am I going to protect these? And I want to maximize the amount of sun I've got, and I've got to protect all my produce against fruit fly and these moths. We get these Chernobyl-sized caterpillars that can strip an entire plant overnight. And I'm not joking.
Yeah,
A delicious monster leaf that is this size,
Mm.
10 of them can be eaten in 2 days and it's gone.
Wow.
So what I thought was I moved my veggie beds into an area where I knew they were going to get the most sunlight, which then opens up the scope of the different species I can grow in there. A huge diversity can now be grown. And I knew that I could structure the inside of my veggie beds to cater for shade requiring species. And I knew that in the summertime, when all of these leafy greens are going to go to bolt because it's hot and it's humid and it's very sunny for a long day, I can use, like the Native American Indians would, a sisterhood. I can grow my corn, which will produce shade for a sub-canopy crop of lettuces and radishes and everything like that. I can grow beans up them so that my corn becomes the structure and I get 3 or 4 crops in the same floor space. But I realized I also have a limited space for fruit trees. So I decided to structure my veggie garden so that I had a living wall around it. And I'm going to espalier all my fruit trees. I've got subtropical peaches and apples and things like that. And I, without concreting them in, and I'll get back to this why, I put posts into the ground, hammered them in, and then connected them all up using fencing post connections. So it's very malleable. You can undo it, move it, and you've got hyper flexibility. And I wired them all up. So they're under tension, and that's where I've planted my espaliered fruit trees. So when they come into growth in the summertime, they've got all their foliage. That produces shade that I can plant in. It creates niches, a sunny spot and a shady spot. It also reduces wind coming through, but it doesn't negate it. It's not a solid surface. It still has permeability. And I can prune them as I want to. But the structure that they're growing on at the same time can become the structure that I throw my net over. So it's multifunctional. But also, when my espaliered fruit trees go dormant, I can grow climbing plants up there, cucumbers and all the things in the off or the cooler season. So the structure becomes something that's malleable. And this dovetails perfectly with my philosophy, my ecological design principles, in that absolutely everything has to have multiple functions. There's no such thing as putting in a lot of energy for one thing. It has to have 2 or 3 or 5 functions as a minimum. If not, then it's high maintenance, and it means I'm going to work. So the structure that I reused an old steel gate, and I elevated above our heads, and now we've got a surface above our heads where I can grow shading species too, and I could put nets. I can protect it against cockatoos and things like that. And it's malleable, it can be moved around. And we'll have a look at Here's the veggie patch with the raised beds. You can see there'll be a sunny side and a shaded spot. And then I've put the steel structure around them. Now that's where my espaliered fruit trees are going to grow around, but I've also got a structure above that I can use for netting, or I could attach wires to it and I can grow climbers up, and I can swap it seasonally as I want to. So the structure has to do quite a bit of work for me, but the fact that it can move, just like the barriers I've got around here with the garden beds, they're not concreted in. And there's a very particular reason for that, is I want all my designs to be flexible. My needs and requirements are going to change, and as the garden grows, there are a certain amount of things that I can't calculate, or I might want to expand and contract. And this image illustrates, I've got a swale system. So I've dug trenches into the ground that collects rainwater from my roof. And I'm moving water through the landscape. But in order to understand how to do it effectively, I had to sit and watch the storm events that were coming through and get a feeling for how much rain there might be or there might not be. And in this case, you can see here's a swale that's about 1.5 feet deep and maybe 2 foot wide that's overflowed. And here it's running through the garden. So now I know that I can tier it and I can create different layers of swales. And here's an example where my downpipe drains into the garden. This was going to be a pond, but now I'm going to grow trees in it, and it overflows into a set of swales that moves the water through the site. You can also see that I've got my garden edging. It's not installed, it's laying there as I'm working out the best spaces. So flexibility that the garden's going to have to move as my swales shift, and flexibility that the swales are going to have to change and move where the trees go. Now in time, I've actually gone and I've started planting. You can see that in this photograph, I'm putting a palm tree in, and the garden beds have taken hold. I've sheet mulched over the weed and the lawn with newspapers, and before I put it down, I inoculated it with fungi and bacteria to help it live. And then I've mulched on top with compost to suppress the weeds, but also to feed and start kick-starting my soils. Now, in time, that garden edge is going to flux and it's going to move because the garden's going to shift and its identity is going to change and my needs are going to change as well. So the flexibility becomes important because I guess if you're designing a garden and you're using trees, for example, the canopy and the size of the tree is going to change as it matures. And your canopy creates a structure. It could be shading for plants underneath it. It could be a host support. And in my case, I'm going to be growing a lot of my research plants into the trees and on the branches, orchids on the branches, and climbing aroids up the trunks. Some will be edible, some will not. And that's why I've got palms. And I guess permaculture and climatology and ecology dovetail in that on so many different levels, we have the edges where two different exposures meet. And that edge is the most dynamic space in an ecology. You often get stability under a tree, under its canopy, or in a rainforest section. And where that rainforest reaches the end of it, it might merge with a scrubland or a grassland or, cliff faces or something like that. So there's an area of constant flux where you've got two different exposure types that are coming together. And they're really good for edible gardens, for example, because it's where you have colonizers, but you also have secondary colonizers meeting and interfacing and competing. And that's where the garden edge is going to be. It's going to be morphing around my tree canopies. And because I'm in the subtropics, my edible food forest is going to be predominated by subtropical and tropical trees. And all of these canopies will create a mosaic or patchwork where in the early days, as the trees are growing and the canopies are small, I have big gaps between them with lots of sun, and I can grow certain types of fruit and veggies. But as the canopies grow, they'll eventually meet. And all of those high sun spaces in between will then transition to dappled light. And as the garden and the trees grow more mature, that'll become darker and deeper shade as well. So the flexibility of not only the initial design with siting trees and looking at where the exposures are, but what I do underneath them is going to change. And in time, the entire identity of the space and the function of it is going to become quite different. So there I'm using trees as structure, but in my veggie patch, I'm using the steel as the structure. And that flexibility and that forethought early on is quite important because it sets the hard structure of what's going to continue, like the shape and form of your rainforest. And then that becomes your malleable thing.
Yeah, great. It's there's so many parallels in there with what I was going to share in this conversation too tonight of mapping out paths here when we first moved into our rental last year. And before I go on to that, I really enjoyed the thinking, because it's often, I don't know if it's brought through as much as it is important as it is, if that makes sense. So the thinking through time, the planning through a garden's evolution has been really, I don't know if it's lost, but it's very, very much in the background of gardening and the way gardening is talked about very commonly in our culture, and I've kind of seen it happen across my horticultural career, which is all my working life. So it's a 20-something, bit more, nearly 25 years, I suppose, of being lucky enough to work in a nursery that was which was small. It was not part of a chain. There wasn't any nurseries that were part of a chain at that point in time. Supermarkets weren't even selling plants. There was no Bunnings at that point. So nursery people were plants people. They were one and the same. And so thinking through time was part of gardening. That's what happened and what you did. And then through the 80s and 90s, or through the 90s and 2000s in particular, that this idea that the garden is an outdoor room and you decor it and decorate it and or paint it with plants, or and so the 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 other cutting side to a program like a backyard blitz approach of moonscape, fully installed semi-advanced palms or decking and thing. There's nothing wrong with that, but what's missing in the thinking is, what's it going to be like in 6, 8, 15, 20 years time? And there's so much hard infrastructure that isn't malleable, like you've designed into your system, where it's, okay, this needs to be structurally sound, because you don't want it coming down on your head when it's loaded with whatever produce it's loaded with. You don't need it blowing over in the wind, but it's also crucial that it's malleable, that you can move the design around as because that's equally important for you in that design. And I think it's I suppose it might be, in one sense, be perceived as being easier just to concrete the poles in. They're not going to fall over. It's a certain depth, and you bolt them all or weld them all or whatever it is, and it's kind of a set and forget. But then you're stuck. Like, that's how it is, unless you do the big work again of digging out the concrete and cutting the poles down and all of that. There's no, there's much more permanence where you need flexibility, and sometimes there's flexibility where you should have more permanence, like putting more trees into your landscape, or and so it's that aspect of thinking through time, which I feel like comes more richly with a larger body of experience and appreciation of how long it takes to tune into and understand an ecology or ecologies, and to think in that way, and to be humble enough that, like you offered in your example, that despite all your experience, which is hefty in applied and theoretical ways, you dug your swales and waited to see what would happen, rather than, because you could have looked at what's the average rainfall for my area, what are the likely storm surges, because you could probably find something like that around that kind of data. What's my roof catchment? How big are my pipes? What's the flow rate? What's the soil roughly absorbing at? That's another way to do it as well. And then you say, okay, so I need my swale to be this big, and you dig it, and that's it. And then when it breaks its banks and floods the other part of your garden, it's much harder to deal with, because you've done all this work at the front end when you could have waited, allowed the system to show you what may or may not be possible with consideration. It's not just, oh, well, I'll put the downpipe on the soil and see where it runs and whatever, because you're intervening already and guiding with purpose and intent, but doing it in ways that allow you to adjust in small increments, so that the consequences of the if it's like you're adjusting to the feedback when it's smaller, quieter, and more like to use one of my favorite people's sayings, more like a little dolphin nudge rather than a big whale shove, just to move you sideways. There's another good phrase from Adam Grubb at Veg, and it's the talking about pruning, that the sooner the cut, the smaller it is. Whereas if you leave it longer and leave it longer, it's it's more work involved. There's all sorts of things. So I might bring up some of these photos I was going to share about when we moved into our rental here in Dalesford last year. And one of the things I wanted to do was work out where the paths are going to go, because it was all pretty much lawn, apart from these bricked details, which are quite nice and well done, but they're not moving, so they're fixed, they're context. And mostly it looked a lot like, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. I've got to change this window there. It's a bit hard to see, but this is there's the shed there, and there's not much in between. There's no paths through this shady area. It's just the leaves falling under the trees, basically. And so through time, I utilized a great resource for free, which is coffee sacks. And I just walked through and put them down more or less where I felt the paths would go. And I sort of folded them out roughly like stepping stones, and then a bit further and bit further. And so I could work on both getting a feel for the path width that I thought might be good, and also where I wanted it to turn, or how far. And this example, it's actually moving up between the two, and then you veer to the right. There's the compost bays up in the far right corner, where you can turn left and loop back around the whole yard and look back at the house, and go through a couple of fruit trees there. And as you can see from the grass in the photo, I left them there for a fair while to get a feel for it, so that we could move those edges and figure out where are those paths going to be. The next step after that was actually laying them out flat, fully sheet mulching, like you did in your example, to knock the grass down. And then we did wood chip across the top. And I've still got wood chip paths. I'm a massive fan of those. It's like $100 for 10 cubes, and all you have to do is barrow it around, and you can smoosh the edges and change it. You're feeding the soil at the same time, which is great for the soil around it. It's soft fall, nice to walk on. The rain absorbs in. Like, there's so many benefits, and it's not for every spot for sure, but for most of my garden it is. And then we did the same with the brickwork, like you were doing. I just laid out the bricks and went, okay, where's the path? Where does the edge feel good? What's wide enough for me and the wheelbarrow to go through and turn here without kicking the tree or without falling over or whatever it is, and being able to make sure that they're not dead straight. Because as soon as I put them in a straight line, like this one we're looking down, it just feels like energetically, it feels like you're going through a straw, and it's just not enjoyable. Whereas just a little twist or turn, a little kink, and occasionally I still adjust them a little bit because they're not set in place. I've just turned them flat, dug them in a little bit, but they're not concreted or anything like that. They're just there at the edge, and now they've settled in. The paths have grown up beside them. The garden beds are coming up beside them, and so they're nestling into place. And it looks really nice to my eye. I mean, there's plenty of people that might argue you need to fix them in place or concrete them or something like that, because they do move if you kick them or you bump them. But for me, that's fine. I'm not willing to be locked into the design, because I don't think these paths are going to move like yours might in your example, but I don't want them hard set. I'd rather kick one over and have to dig it back in than even do all the work. Like, all I had to do was lie them down and let the garden bed pretty much grow over them. I didn't have to dig them out and level them and get them right and mix up mortar and not do it in the rain and all those kind of things. In that way, I'm definitely a lazy gardener. I'll take the easier option for sure. Thank you.
But there is certainly wisdom in that. And even as a designer, some people really celebrate designers that get the right look. But so often it comes back to what is a good designer. A good designer isn't someone that creates amazing landscapes or end product. They create something that the client actually needs and wants, something that merges with their lifestyle. And don't use something you don't need to. If the client has a flexible life, then creating a rigid garden that looks perfect isn't going to sit well with that family in that space. And just like you with my pathways, I lined them up so that I could use the space for a while. And even though I've done this for decades as well, it always surprises you if you immerse yourself in the landscape, you respond differently. And I realized I used my paths differently. If I
Mm.
walk, I use it one way. If I'm pushing a wheelbarrow, I use it a different way. And my priorities change. You've got your high priority, quick pathways where you need to get from A to Z, and you've got winding, slow pathways that allow you to become immersed and make it a journey. And
Yeah.
it changes. A pathway isn't just a pathway. Sometimes a pathway is an energy line. And an
Mm.
energy line is expenditure. From here to there, what are you trying to do? Are you going to a shed or are you going to the compost heap? You're doing it 3 times a week or you're doing it every single day? But it's also
Yeah.
pathways. My swales are positioned on top of my sewerage lines, pipe work underground. So
Yeah.
now, if we ever need to do work on it, it's not a huge excavation, but it's protected. But it's also stopping me from planting a tree there. So it's very functional in that
Yeah.
way, and it's a flexible, malleable space as well. Um,
Yeah.
as the garden changes over time, and often you were talking brilliantly about time scales. And often in my case, if you're planting a tree or a food forest, you've got to think in terms of how long does it take a sapling plant, a tree, to grow into a mature sized tree that you want, if you're going to prune it or leave it to go naturally. That often
Mm.
sets the time scale of what's going to happen underneath it. And that's going to then dictate to you how much time you've got to do what you want to do underneath it. And it's the same if you're revegetating. It's the same if you're creating a formal landscape. How long is it going to take for something to reach its mature form? So that's really interesting. And exactly
Mm.
like you said, the older generations would often think a little bit differently. And when I was a gardener, my life process changed so dramatically as well because I started feeling and thinking in terms of seasons. And that
Mm.
psychologically it changed how I looked at a space and how I felt about it and how I dreamt about how I could use it. Where now, with my day to day, very frenetic lifestyle, I've got to make decisions in hours that impact the client for decades. So you've got to think so
Yeah.
differently. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a different pressure coming to play there, that's for sure. And that's where yeah, I think the experience definitely helps when you're
Mm,
dabbling
mm.
in that space and looking to deliver under pressure, which is what it is.
Yes, but it's also very revealing and quite exciting. Absolutely, there's a commercial
Mm.
pressure, but what it does is a lot of people, especially if they haven't had opportunity to enlist the help of someone that's very efficient or proficient at this, is your process of assessing can be very drawn out and slow, where sometimes it can be
Mm.
helpful to have an external agent come in and help not make decisions for you, but guide decision processes with questions that you provide all the input, but to guide you through the process. And no doubt, if you were here looking at my pathways, you might have come to the same conclusion a lot quicker, where I took a step back and I allowed time to transition quite a bit because I had a bit of decision paralysis as well. Because it's my space, and I'm trying to design with the emotion as well. Yeah.
Of course.
It-
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's yeah, it I think it's a beautiful thing that has become a little bit more lost as well is design designing at the human scale. So I I can't remember where I came across it, but there's a unit of measure that we used to utilize much more, that is actually the length of the human forearm from your wrist to your elbow, and that's as a I'll have to
Mm,
look it up and put the link in.
mm,
But more or less standard unit of measure. It's a unit of measure that you're pretty much always going to have with you when you're moving around. And similarly with um, what I was thinking and feeling about the path design work is, okay, I want to walk these paths. I want to push a wheelbarrow on them. I want to turn this corner and see how tight is too tight, because I don't want this whole
mm,
area to be a path, which would be
mm,
easier. Because
mm,
then when I'm wheelbarrowing through, I don't have to consider the way that I'm taking this corner. I can just barge through and be not present, I suppose.
mm,
But I
mm,
actually like designing for myself a path that means I do need to be present. I need to think about the
mm,
line that I'm taking,
mm,
like a race car driver with my wheelbarrow. Not that I'm racing through, but it keeps me present because I don't want an overly large path. I want to be able to fit, like our example, the junction where 3 or 4 paths come together. There's a water bowl feature there that has beautiful things spilling out of it, and I have to go around that every time. So I need enough room to do it, but I'm not sacrificing that water bowl because it's easier just to go straight through and not have a junction. It's like, no, that is there. So how
Yeah.
do we make this work? Because I need to feed my soul when I'm pushing the wheelbarrow umpteen times a day, as much as my body and my mind, in doing things. So yeah, using a design process, I guess, that allows you to do that is really key. And I think maybe one of the challenges we have currently in our time is that the the thinking, you can't do any of that in a rush. Like the design work and practical work and installation work that you've been doing in your place is across this, I suppose, not considerable, but it's across time and through time. It's not just done. Oh, we've finished the garden. Now we can repaint the inside of the house, or all these things. It's not, because you take what's perceived as, or could be judged as, a slower approach, because you're taking so many more things into consideration at the beginning. That is a different kind of work that hopefully leads to less work and less work and less work, and it kind of loops us around on the seed that I was chewing on, to start a conversation of this. Conscious design is this aspect of considering, what does the client need, what feels good to me, what does my family need, how do we need to utilize this space, how do we want to utilize this space. But my youngster's not going to be the same like the trees. He's going to be bigger and wanting to do other things in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. So what do I do with bringing some of those spaces into fruition? But I don't need them yet. I only need to consider them in time and later on. And by that, through those design processes and allowing that time for things to emerge and for things to happen, so you can see with your eye and feel with your body that experience of, this is what it means to be in a tropical rainstorm up here. Right, that's a flow rate I could have calculated, but boy, it's different to what I anticipated, or and so you can adjust accordingly if you haven't gone too far down it shall be like this type decision making and road. And for me, that's where that comes around to the lazy gardener, or there's a mob, I think they're based in the UK, called the Idler. There's a magazine that they publish called the Idler, and the How to Be Idle. So how to sit back under a tree and enjoy and be present in life. This sort of things that mindfulness, I suppose, is also an adjunct to, or an expression of, or exploring, that you can design a space and a process and a even a way of life for more of that immersion through time.
Right. So many interesting points, and there's so many different things involved there that also work so well together. Just like you can have a look at each project, and subdivisions of the project can be dealt with in the same way as having your zones. You've got a high priority zone that you know you're going to use a lot, then your lower priority zone, which is further out, and then your furthest is one that you're going to access less. But that also applies to psychologically. Your high priority zone is the one that you maybe feel needs most attention, and then you scale it outwards as well. And could I show you a share screen quickly where I'll...
These do.
Here we go. So this is a plan of our garden, and where I've highlighted is where the slope in the land is. So running under our house, it slopes from this side downwards to that side. So the first thing I recognized was how water was going to move through it. And this is one of the reasons why I took my time, and I didn't immediately start putting my swales in. I started planning for them, thinking about how the water would move through, but I waited for a storm event to see what it actually does on the land, so that I could utilize a principle of least energy input to gain the most out of that. And then on top of that, I superimposed where we walk through our site. Now this color over here is where cars drive. We park under our house, we reverse out, and this is our entry area. We've got a second area where we could swap cars around. And then this color is human traffic around the house, how we would come through the front and exit out the back. And this is my office, or the little cottage, where we'd come down the stairs into the office or down to my composting bays, which are tucked away under the tree, or on this side where I've got my native beehive and a little shed and my shade house. So I thought, okay, if I map where I'm going to walk, that will provide me an understanding of where the paths might need to be. And I can find my nexus points. For example, here where I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pathways that come together. Where over here I've just got a long stretch of a single one. And that's exactly what you were talking about, where I realized where the high priority areas would be on this side, and this side would be low priority because there's less traffic. And then on these far sides, there's quite a bit of traffic converging there and there, but very little in between. And this is where some of my paths were a little bit straight, but you can see I have the same philosophy as you, no real straight lines, they all curve, so that you lose your path. When you look ahead, part of it's obscured, and it forces your creative mind to query, where am I going? Should I slow down? What's happening? And you start every single time you walk through the garden. It's a little bit of an adventure, but also the path type stops. Down here, I've got a high quality path with mulch like you do, a living path that's feeding the soil. But as I start moving further into the garden, my path becomes less and less and less defined. And eventually it might not actually be a path that I construct. It would rather be a path that gets made by my traffic. And that's what I like. It gets narrower because at the same time, I've got a blank slate. This whole property was just turf. And I want my son to get immersed into it. So when I plan my fruit forest and my rainforest, and I've got all my plants through it, I want him to also have areas that he has to escape, and that he can escape as well. As a parent, a lot of parenting is also about letting go. And as long as I create a safe perimeter around the property, I would like my young son to also feel trusted, that he doesn't have to have a helicopter parent, but he can disappear and he can immerse himself in it. And that means going off the beaten track, which means I must have an off the beaten track area too. And I think that's part of nurturing the person, but it's also respecting the landscape, because if I control everything on my property, then I'm not really respecting the landscape because I'm imposing myself on it. So there has to be, in my philosophy, a transition zone, a section where the landscape takes on its own form, and it will teach me as well. So hopefully I also realize I don't want to take too much on at the same time. So there's some projects that are for tomorrow, some projects for next month, some for the next few years. And that's also giving myself a break. But it's giving myself an opportunity to be idle and to have a long-term perspective through it as well. Yeah, so we'll see where that goes. I don't have an answer for that yet, but it's exciting.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most challenging and possibly one of the most life-enriching lessons I've learned through this space. And there's no particular event where it's I learned a lesson through this challenge or something, but I'm a very big emotion person, and I don't always have patience, but horticulture has tapped in or taught me or brought me into a different thinking space. So horticulture and gardening and those aspects have brought me to a place where will help me understand and see the world, where I have much more patience to be able to feel the yearning for a yard, a garden, an example that's not all turf, that it does have places for someone to go through and disappear and hide and explore and dig holes and fill them in and experience all the richness of life. But it's not there yet. And I can do some towards it today. I can do some towards it next week. I can do some towards it next year. And through that time, it means, if you have that, those design decisions we were talking about earlier that alleviate you from having to put in that high maintenance for a narrow niche return. You know, if you've got to power wash your concrete paths, for example, because they get the algae on them, and then they're slippery for everyone. It's like that is not the height of human ecological stewardship that it's portrayed to be. It's because, you know, that's high maintenance by anybody's measure, surely. Whereas through time, you can have the space grow and become, and it allows for, as you'd offered, it allows for things to change. It allows for you to change. It allows for your young fella to change and grow into the space and be changed by that space. And I think, I wonder if that's one of the things that we don't experience as much as humans in our more urban, frenzied, frenetic pace that we seem to be accelerating further into. Although there's a good dose of us, I think, also yearning and playing in this space where we're peeling off and going, oh, no, I can dip in and out. I can speak to you into that space. But I can also help you see another way, or experience another way, or feel another way, perhaps, or not, in which case that's okay too. I'll see you later.
That's great. It's a wonderful thought where, I guess, as I don't want to say we're an evolved species, because we really are no more evolved than anything else. Evolution doesn't have a scale.
No.
And it doesn't have an end point or start point. We have been evolving on par with bacteria. It's just we're a different evolution. And I guess when we're in a landscape, as we do find ourselves, and we can be agents of change in it, just like a tree is an agent of change in the landscape too, we can take on the role as a steward, like you say. We can recognize long-term inputs and changes, and we can actually influence them a little bit more than, say, a field mouse would. You know, we can actually have a far reach and a very much a multi-dimensional change across a range of different areas with a wider reach. But at the same time, we can move in and out of that relationship with the landscape. I yearn not to be a steward of a landscape. I yearn to be part of the landscape, which means I am the agent of change with the trees, but my reach is as far as I can walk, or what I can do. So yeah, it's oscillating between all of those functionalities, which is quite important. And often, I mean, on a practical level, I often talk to or talk with people that are collectors, and they might grow in a greenhouse or a shade house, a very artificial environment. I have them as well. And people often ask me for advice on how to deal with a certain type of species in a certain climate. And often it comes back to the same question. Okay, we've got through the nitty-gritty. You now know how to adjust your growing conditions to grow this high altitude philodendron. But have you asked yourself the question, why are you growing it? You know, why are you collecting them? And some people, you know, realize, well, I guess I'm indoors and I do have to pay a lot for lighting and for humidity control and so on. Why don't I select a more low altitude, ambient, indoor conditions tolerant species? Then it frees me up to do a range of different things, or frees up my resources. And it's just a thought, you know, it's so easy to get caught up in the amazingness of things that we sometimes get quite far along a track, and you need to not rein yourself in, but just query what am I doing? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's a good question. I think that we do as a species need to be asking ourselves a bit more firmly, I guess, because we are so empowered with the abundance of life, actually, of as we describe it, as resource. We have so much resource, technological, food, and other things, wealth, that we're able to squander it, I suppose, if without being too judgmental about it. But we're able to decide that, oh, well, I did concrete my shade house in the wrong spot, so I am going to just cut it down, go again over there and re-concrete it in and do it again, because it's not, you know, I just pay someone else to do it, and my opportunities are such that I'm able to do that quite commonly in the more urban, you know, affluent, for whatever that means, lifestyle, where you have those kinds of choices. Whereas I think that question of why am I collecting all these philodendrons or all these aroids? And I've been down the collector road before, and I try not to too much, because I've realized I can't end up. All I have is every single Haworthia that exists, and they're amazing plants. I love them. They're very beautiful, but I do push things climatically at an edge, because I want to, and I'm trying and seeing what's there, and I have to ask myself that same question of how much energy resource am I putting into growing vanilla in Dalesford, for example, and the answer is not very much. It's sitting in the window and it's growing and it's survived, so okay, it's doing pretty well. But if I move it somewhere harder, then the same question is asked again of myself, and asking that. And I think one of the things that it's not a paucity mindset, and it's not a knee-jerk response to an abundance of wealth being squandered, as we sort of touched on, or being utilized in ways that aren't more life generative, because I feel that's the nub, that's the crux of what we're talking about here, is making decisions such that life supports more life, allows the opportunity for more life, like the example you gave last time of complexity in an ecosystem building and growing through time. So it's not coarse-grained like a wall. There's lots of many small pieces through time that becomes more diverse. And through their conscious decision-making of why am I doing this, and choosing to apply energy in particular areas to grow an ecosystem in a particular way, means that you can have abundance come back in different ways down the track, which is what we're talking about. The opportunity to sit under a tree and not be stewarding actively. You become a participant in. You can remember that you're always a participant in, because you are, but you don't always have time for that, because you're thinking, I've got to get the mulch down and the things fed and those ones planted, and then I've got to get back in on the computer, and that's that thinking, I suppose, that allows you to open it up and say, okay, a little bit slower here, a bit of a boundary here, a consideration there. And none of this is by any means passive, because I'm guessing you broke a sweat when you're mulching your paths and digging holes and things like that. It doesn't just happen itself. You still have to do the work,
Yes.
but you do it astutely and in time, and then it opens you up to be more immersed or more inside, and as you say, an agent of change inside the ecosystem, without having to carry the load of the ecosystem.
Absolutely, it's wonderfully said. It's making the shift from designing a thing or designing a process, or using plants as products as opposed to agents of change, in a way. And if you'd like, I could show you a vertical garden that I've just recently designed with a site of, let's have a look-see. Okay, here we go. Here's the site. It's down in Melbourne. This is below ground level. Ground level is over there, and they cut this out to construct a courtyard, which is fantastic because it allows so much light into the space, but they wanted to vegetate it. And the challenge is it's on the south-facing side of a building, so it's in winter it'll be in permanent shade, but in summertime it's big enough and separated far enough from the house that it will produce, or it will experience full sun. So you can see there. Now, what I did here is, this is an illustration in the design software that I use of the vertical garden, and it's got three sides to it. That's the left side that we saw. This is a large central section, and this is the right side. Now, many people might look at these different color swathes with all these plants in it and think that I was designing with a look in mind, but actually it's hyper functional. Let's just look at the central piece over here. At the top of the garden, I've got tree species in groups, with large species in the center and slightly smaller species along the outside. Some of them produce an open canopy, some of them produce a closed canopy. So when this garden gets installed, these will all be saplings. They'll be very small, and pretty much most of the garden will receive full sun. But as they develop, they'll produce a canopy that'll close in a portion of the space. So I guess the practical decision there is, do I design for shade or do I design for the full sun? Technically, I have to design for both simultaneously. So how do you combat that? You use species at the top of the wall that can handle full sun and wind, and then lower down species that can handle shade, and species in between that can move up and down as they require according to their own conditions. So this planting plan is pretty much a starting point where the race starts and the garden will start competing. So initially there'll be lots of sun coming down to the bottom, and the plants will probably be quite compact. At the end of the first 12 months, the canopy will start showing, and they'll probably be growing to 2 foot or so from the host wall, which will be producing shade to maybe the midpoint. But by the end of the second year, the canopy will be large enough to produce shade to the bottom. And what these plants at the bottom here are semi-sun tolerant climbers that eventually will climb up into the garden as well, chasing whatever sun they want and then stopping pretty much where their tolerance level is met. And many of these vertical swathes are species that either cascade down or climb up, and horizontal swathes are species that are used as boundaries or barriers to separate other species. Now, another thing I've noticed is these clients had absolutely no idea what they wanted. They liked everything. They struggled to really conceptualize a design, and they weren't sure how they were going to use the space. So using this kind of diversity, if we zoom out, you can see down here, that's a big list of species that's used in it. So very high diversity will cater for quite a range of different aesthetics, but also will allow the garden to change over time. And it'll be adaptable enough to allow the maintenance to adjust how it works for them as well. And I guess that's one of the challenges we have. In this case, it's a small project, which is very difficult for a designer to work with, because it's a client that isn't sure about the use of the space or what they would like. So if you use an ecological design process, you're hedging a range of different things. You also, if you have a potential to fail with your assessment of sun or shade, then the diversity can help to fill those gaps and to round the edges and to soften the blows, so to speak. So it's highly functional. And each species is going to have to work really hard, because all of them are going to be doing a range of different functions. And some of them might be semi-sacrificial, some of them won't. Some of them will be very aggressive or rapid to grow, and some of them will be slow and probably tolerant of a wide range of conditions. So it also takes a lot of pressure off the designer. And if you're at home designing your veggie patch or your garden, or looking at the spaces, applying even to a formal garden where you are going to concrete everything in, if you utilize an ecological design approach or a systems approach, then it's hyper-functional.
Yeah, and so is some of the maintenance or the species that you've chosen, the maintenance requirements for those is not somewhat malleable, because they need what they need, and how they are and how they live is how they are and how they live. But I presume, I suppose, or just to more to ask the question, because you don't know how the client's going to use the space, because the client doesn't know how they're going to use the space, then the maintenance requirements would probably need to reflect that to a certain extent. So it's not either high maintenance, or potentially, if they do get excited and start to get into it, then there's no maintenance and they can't actually do anything, and they stand there looking at it like a piece of art that they can't do anything with.
Yes, indeed, absolutely. Some of the rationale is plants are grown and produce the structure that you don't necessarily want people to always be changing, because if they cut all the canopies back, then they alter the sun and they could scorch the plants below. They site it to the top of the wall. So they are the species that you would touch and access the least. Species to the center and the bottom of the wall are more accessible, and they're the ones that are probably more malleable that way. So you can swap and change as your needs change. If they want more color or more texture, they can move within those spaces and change them. But the angle, size, and direction of the sways are very functional as well, because they divide it into sections. And for example, where we have a species that is quite rapid growing that will want to climb, you can insert a swathe of another species to be a living barrier to hold it back, which buys you time to decide what you want to do with it or nothing at all. So the idea behind it is, with every project, I try to create a project that will survive the zombie apocalypse and will persist in a natural state, and where natural processes will simply play out as they need be, and the sacrifice or the loss of a species will be minimal. The idea is to create a garden that can self-repair, that can adjust, and part of that process is looking at simple things like, or it's not simple, I guess, it is semi-simple, is pest and disease control. A swathe that is used to separate an aggressive growing species from a slow growing species can also function, if you choose your plant groups right, to also act as a barrier against pests and diseases. So if I've got a fern that gets aphid, I'm not going to put it next to another species I'm aware also gets aphid quite easily. I'd rather put a more resilient species between them, and it separates them. And it also allows our beneficial insects time to come and prey and move through the space and assist to control it as well. So everything has to be multifunctional, whether it's a stone or a plant or a path or mulch, for example.
Yeah, it's an impressive and inspiring skill and way of thinking, I think, which is quite, no doubt, and I've certainly found it this way too, is quite daunting when you haven't tried it before, or you haven't played around and experimented with design of some kind or another. You know, I used to think that I could never do design, and because I cannot, or do not, I could maybe, I do not approach a blank canvas and then come up with this whiz-bang inspiration and then just ta-da, there's your design and off you go, and isn't it fantastic? I'll autograph it for you. And I don't, maybe not many designers do that anyway. Maybe they do, I don't know. But I always, because that was my understanding of design, I felt I didn't have it. And I learned actually through my time at the Botanic Gardens and stewarding the greenhouse there, that, and looking back on that time, probably more importantly, I realized that that's what I was doing there all the time, was moving, because it's all in pots. So it's a malleable system. It was very high maintenance. I watered there 2-3 times a week by hand. There was no irrigation system. It was all manual. But I really enjoyed that, because through that time, I'm checking on everybody, seeing what's going on. No one else is in the greenhouse. I have it all to myself. But I'd be moving those pots and potting up the trees into larger pots to get that canopy cover. So you walk under and through, and the paths, like you offered before, are not straight. You know where you're going, but you can't see what's a little bit more. And so it's inviting, because it's just bringing you on a gentle curve to come through. It's not, oh, you look down there, particularly if you're too sight oriented and you're thinking, you look, oh yeah, I've seen it, okay, and then you go back out the door. It brings you through to turn around and see, that I never would have seen that orchid in a basket up there if I hadn't walked here and then stopped in this little bulbous cul-de-sac where I have time to be held and to admire and then move on and move through. And that's designing from all the experience, the learning, the education, because you need to know your species like something fierce. You have to know for different climates, what they do as a lifestyle, what their irrigation needs are, what happens when they're old and how long they're going to last and what happens then. All of those things which are, you can't experience that in a lifetime for all the species that you're working with.
Indeed.
I wouldn't think, in growing them and knowing it firsthand, but you can learn it through information. And then
Yes.
you bring your humanness
Mm.
and your knowledge and experience of being a human immersed and always interconnected in an ecosystem that
Mm.
we're always in, to
Mm.
then I suppose apply the different decisions, or make different decisions towards a circumstance that's going to support diversity
Mm.
without being overwhelming, that supports functionality without being boringly utilitarian, that supports beauty without being all pomp and ceremony with no substance and resilience. All of these things
Mm.
that are crucial, especially for vertical gardens.
Yeah.
And then it comes to this, and somebody on the beautiful receiving end says, "Oh, thanks, Erik. That's great. When can you come and install it? We'll fly you down and put you to work."
Yeah. You mentioned design work and what makes it accessible to people, and I fully agree with you. Design can seem daunting, and there's often a sense that you have to know everything to be able to start, but it's
Mm,
not true. If you're methodical with it, you can take a lot of the pressures off yourself. And for example, what I do, whether it's on a micro scale on a vertical garden or a macro scale in my garden, is I acknowledge that I'm going to learn and I'm going to enjoy the process of failing and building a very big compost heap. So what I've done is, for example, my trees and my walls and my pathways become the structure to the garden. And they, if I'm clever, they are flexible. So I can move my pathways and I can change the plantings around the walls, etc. Now, as the tree grows, I might have 10 or 15 years, depending on the species, to play beneath
mm,
it. And that frees me to experiment while I'm watching and learning the tree. And I create pockets within my designs, whether it's a pocket on the center or the left-hand side of a vertical garden, or the far corner of my garden, where I have a forgiving space where I'm going to design it to the best of my ability, but it's going to be provided with some freedom. For example, I might sow seed there, or I might put a species there that I know will be rambunctious and it will shift, and I'm going to watch and learn and observe and work with it. And I'm going to see where the seedlings come up, where they survive, where those die, and then look a little bit closer and try to figure out why. Is it dryness, or is it the type of the soil, or the impact of the tree?
mm,
And then the landscape starts teaching me, and you've got time to get immersed in it and to make very deliberate mistakes, have fun with it, but also to take a step back and to learn that sometimes those incompleted processes, or the process that are still unfolding, are in and of themselves complete as well. Um,
yes.
so my pathways, like you, I'm going to have a wood chip pathway, but the reason why I'm doing it is I'm going to plant the sides of it, and eventually I'm going to allow these plants to encroach over it. And my end goal is to have no pathways; they're all living pathways. I want to host a plant in every crack and nook and cranny I can, because I want to eat it, and I want to be able to walk barefoot if I can, and I
Yeah.
wanted to cool the space, and I wanted to feed all the pollinators so I don't have to spray my herbs and veggies. And I want to learn, because there's so many plants that I've studied and I know of, or I know, but there's so much more to be revealed. And all you can do then is put it in the ground and step back and crack a beer and watch it. You know, so a flexible design is modular, and you can achieve it on a balcony or on a large scale as well. And it's interesting dealing with some of the larger landscape architects who landscape architecture is such an intensive subject, because the field expects them to be everything. They have
Mm,
to be a mediator, they have to be an architect, they have to be an engineer, they have to be a botanist, they have to be a horticulturalist, they have to be an ecologist, they have to be a historian, they have to understand culture and sociology and psychology. And that's impossible. And you can't learn that in single lifestyle. So often you become a master of, jack of all trades, but a master of none. But what it teaches them is to be the conduit, the core that these things can
mhm,
gravitate around. And a good designer in that case admits they don't know all the plants, admits they don't know all the history and so on, but they can produce sufficient coherence that the space itself can do a lot of the work for them. And so they become a translator. And that's my job, and that's your job, I guess, when you're designing your home, is you're not actually the end solution. You're translating the situation or the concept or the client's wishes into a form. You're corralling it, and hopefully if you can work with them, then they become part of the solution. It takes a lot of pressure off yourself. Same with your plants. You know, we're not growing the plants. We're not necessarily always a steward. We sow the seed, and we're going to now move around this plant and work with it, and it'll reveal half the answers that you didn't know the questions to ask.
Touche. Yeah, well said. I think it surely it should be the goal of almost every gardener to sit back and crack a beer or any beverage of choice and watch life be life. You know, I think that's one of the things we can really factor much more into our time and lives, and make time for, move other things aside for, so that we can and share that together. You know, it's one of the beautiful experiences of being alive. It's one of the points of being alive, I think. The key reasons to be alive.
Indeed, yeah. You mentioned a little point about an orchid that I had in the garden. And if you don't mind, I'll just quickly show the image of it. This is a quick one. It illustrates exactly what we're talking about, but on a micro scale, and it's very accessible. Let's see if here it is. So this is a Dendrobium hybrid that's in a jacaranda tree in the garden, and it's flowering like gangbusters. But it grows on a couple of different aspects: a full sun and a shade and a high wind area. And there's so much to learn. And I guess that's one of the questions is, some people, whether they're gardeners or designers, often we assume that this basic knowledge, how do I look at something and actually learn? It's okay to say that we're going to sit back and watch the landscape and all this wisdom is going to just automatically move into our heads and we're going to walk away a sage. But what are you looking for? And let's just have a look at a few different images here. It's nestled in the branch of a tree. It's now covered in flowers, but at some stage it's just going to be foliage. There's some the stems here that have leaves on them, and there's some that are bare, that have dropped the leaves, whether they're old or they've been stressed. This is the sunny side, taken at exactly the same time as the shady side. And you can see upright, pointing, more rigid leaves and stems. And if we go back to the shady side, slightly more cascading stems as a result of more shade. Close up, you can see there's quite high density, but the magic here is that I was looking at this species and I was trying to figure out, now I'm going to be covering all my trees and orchids, by the way. This is my grand scheme, but I'm going to learn from what is already here. And when it rains, the rain collects on the bark of this jacaranda and slowly migrates down. And as with all trees, it collects, you have a higher concentration of it where the branches come together, because you've got two branches, two harvesting surfaces. Now, one side might be in shade that gets the same amount of water, for example, as the sun and the portion on the sunny side, but the sun will evaporate most of that water away, where the shady side might have that moisture remain just for a few minutes or half an hour or a few hours longer. So the plant's roots that are on the shady side will gain more nutrient and moisture than the plant or the side of the plant growing in the sunny side. But the parts of the plant on the sunny side will gain more solar bombardment and more photosynthetic energy than the sections on the shady side. So immediately I'm learning from looking at a single branch. Firstly, I can see that this species can tolerate the sun and the shade. It grows quite well with high exposure, but chances are it's going to flower better where it produces or it experiences less stress. So now immediately I've got a little model I can look at. I know that if I target the nooks or the joints in tree branches as nuclei for me to start colonizing my trees from, I'm onto a good thing. Because I can, if I want to use a single branch that's exposed, I'll be extending my neck and taking a bit of a gamble. I'll be making quite a lot of assumptions. So we can see a shortcut now. I can now start adding ripsalis and a range of different orchids under the shade of this section here. If I've got an orchid that's more sun tolerant, I can add it to the above it, and I can monitor it in time and see if it becomes super stressed or not. And then I'll learn about what I'm going to do on the next adjacent branch. And maybe I'd be better off not putting them on the north side. I might put them on the south side and observe what my survival rates are. But not only that, if I group them together, it means that I only need to water this one clump, where if I spread them apart, I've got to cover distance and water a greater area. So this is just a basic ecological principle. With my design, I don't design an entire site in one go. I grow my design. I'll look at a map of the area and I'll choose my pathways. And then I'll figure out where the nuclei are, where a lot of pathways merge, and I know that those are high traffic, high priority areas. And then I'll start working on that with the client or my personal requirements and my projections of what I'd like from that space. And I'll concentrically start adding more detail and expanding outwards as it starts making sense to me. And now and again, that helps me, because it helps me to stop, look at what I've done. And if I realize I've made a mistake, there's something I've missed, I haven't gone too far along the path with investing in my garden and the design. And the same applies to the single branch, or looking at the water flowing through my swales and overflowing. I could have dug all those swales in early, but I realized by putting my first swale in, I saw how quickly it overflowed. I also saw where it overflowed and where it overflowed to. So after that rain event, I took photos to remind me, because I'd forget half the details with my goldfish memory. And then I dug my second swale where the overflow was, which was energy efficient because I didn't have to lift my spade. And I watched the second overflow event, the storm event. And if it captured all of it, then great. I'd put that aside and I'd move on to the next project. But it also informed me where I can plant my trees if I want to have the most moisture. The dry tolerant tree on the northern side, or the upslope side, and the moisture requiring tree to the southern side. And it's just a patience thing of observing, making an incremental change. And it takes so much pressure off you. It really does.
It does.
Yeah, but it compartmentalizes things to a degree, and it allows you to park it and come back to it. But it's also super energy efficient.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think is one of the beautiful things, and that's probably a nice place to pull the thread taut for our conversation. That the energy efficiency, which is one of the principles, I think, in ecosystem dynamics, is and not efficiency as, I suppose, one of the ways I think about it, not efficiency as anti-waste, because life is abundant when it is functioning. It is fecund. It is that ferns don't produce a few spores to save some for next year and try again. When they go for it, they go for it. When life is abundant, when your peach trees start fruiting and keep fruiting, there is an abundance there. And as those change agents, as you're offering, we can interact with that abundance. But that doesn't. At the same time, there is a principle of efficiency, which is not waste minimization. That's messing around with a symptom of erroneous thinking. Efficiency is being able to step a little bit early. Efficiency is being able to adjust before there's you're still making the same big decision. You're just making it sooner and smaller so that you can adjust accordingly. That's what's efficient, rather than investing a vast amount of energy and then having to change that circumstance. You have to reinvest a similar amount or more energy to change the circumstance again. Whereas life doesn't waste like that, because that is a waste in that sense, because you could have done it differently. And that's where that efficiency comes in of, I don't have to rush. I can take time, because there is time, because time is whatever I decide it to be. It's just this, and we work cyclically and seasonally, because there's things I don't know yet. There's information I don't have to hand yet, which is how big are the storm surges, or what kind of place is my youngster going to like to get lost in? Does he want to be in the sun, or does he want to be in the deep shade down the back, hiding where no one can see him? Maybe he doesn't even know yet. So, that's efficient, is having enough potency. It kind of reminds me of meristems or cambium cells, where the cells have they have the potential to become most other cells, but they're unspecialized until the need arises, and then they become specialized. And in a way, such that more stem cells are available and possible. It's not just used up and now, okay, my diversifying is finished, I'm now as I am. It's still possible to shift and adjust further, because the system is supporting those seed potentials, and also supporting the diversification of those, and the readjustment of those. And that, I love that in life, that flow, that magic, that shifting and moving, and because we are at the front edge of that crashing foam of reality becoming. We're at that wave, and like you said before, we're no more evolved than anything else, because if you actually understand evolution for what it means, everything you see, bump into, and participate with is at the same point in time as us. It's all evolved. Like if you're thinking of time in a linear sense and evolution in that understanding, we're all at that same edge, being evolved as that edge moves forward. So no one's further or back. We've just decided as the ruler to delineate things and differentiate things, which is powerful. But we've forgotten that that's not a hierarchy. There is no hierarchy. Everything's at the same front line.
Yes, so well said. That's beautifully stated. Super intelligence isn't a higher evolution to elegantly simple intelligence. They all might contain 10,000 iterations, but maybe if something didn't need to change because it was so fit for purpose, it could technically be the pinnacle of evolution.
Yeah.
Something is constantly changing. It means that it hasn't yet found the optimum efficiency. There's a requirement, there's an impetus for change. And so well said, with whether you're studying or designing or growing or taking a step back to grow, nature grows in pulses, and the pulses are appropriate to what's appropriate to now and what resources are available now. So although we do plan ahead, we plan ahead, so often the planning is just a platform that doesn't necessarily have to be completed through. It's a structure that's there, that's laying the foundation for what you do now, and what you do now can then change it again. It's wonderful the way you stated it. That was lovely.
Yeah, well, you're inspiring more conversations in me and ideas, so I'll make sure I jot them down so we can loop back around on these. I love that. Yeah, nature growing in pulses. It reminds me of tree rings that are different diameters depending on the season and the access to nutrient and water load and all of those things. There's so many ways to see and uncover that truth. It's it's beautiful. Thank you. It's awesome. Such a great conversation. I'm very much enjoying this interaction.
It's most certainly my pleasure. I'm loving it. Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Erik. Thanks for sharing all your photos with us. I'll put us back on the double one. Oh, we'll keep one of the photos there. Why not?
There we go.
It's a beautiful orchid. I love seeing things that feed your soul and your body. And I'm looking forward to the next conversation together.
Oh, likewise. I'll start jotting down ideas now as well. There's so many tangents, aren't there?
Yes, there are. Terrific. Thanks, mate. We'll enjoy your evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.